Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is my buddy Barry Mazor. He's going to share some stories about Merle Haggard.
If you're the kind of person like me, and I think you are, but if anybody like me, if something comes up, some interesting musical fact, you don't let it go. You say, you hear something, you say, where did that come from? Well, wait, where did that come from? How did that happen? How did that happen is what I do for a living. And it turned out that Merle Haggard is exactly the same kind of person. I mean, people know him as this, one of the great figures, to me, the greatest figure in country music, arguably, because who else is as good a songwriter and a brilliant singer and a band leader? And also this guy who's deeply interested in the history of the music and the people he loved and has gone to great lengths sometimes to dig at that. So short version of that one is we hit it off. People who know his Jimmy Rogers set, which, of course, was a connecting point. His Bob Wills set, even the work on Emmett Miller that he did, though it never became a separate record. Also Elvis, which people forget he cared about. But he spent a lot of time, a lot of effort on those things. And what he would talk to me about in terms of those is that he was far from an academic. I mean, the guy, I think he finished high school. I don't know, he was in jail. But in any case, Merle would talk about getting it right. It was very important to him to get these stories right, like it was right to learn the music right, to play it right, not the lyrics. He's not, and I'm not, of folklorists who were sort of historically hung up on their versions of the lyric over 5,000 years or something. In the 20th century and this one, the important thing, which some people got and some people didn't get, was how doing the song would evolve. So I used to have that on my radio show where I would show a song in the hands of different performers. What did the performers do with the damn thing? And that's what mattered to him too. He was he wanted to get down, how did the Bob Wills band do those parts exactly? And then how am I going to do it? Because he didn't do them exactly the same way ever, which is what interesting musicians do. Some other, what's it to me? So that got to be the nature of our conversation. And the first one we had at length was kind of perfect in that regard. He did the album Unforgettable, which was Merle doing jazz standards. It wasn't country music at all. And my complicated background is such that, I knew these things. I mean, Charlie Parker's Kid was my roommate when I was 13, but that's a whole other story. I discovered I liked three chords and all the lies that go with them, not the complicated music, but he found his along the way. I'll give you an example of the kind of thing he would say. People so associate him with Bob Wills, rightly, because, he knew Wills, he loved him, he did the last recordings with him. But he would say, Barry, really, they should talk about Milton Brown more. It really mattered. There was no father of Western swing, and Bob Wills would have told people that there wasn't any one of us. There was a bunch of us, so they should get that right. That's the Merle kind of way of talking about it. When he did the Unforgettable album, and we were talking over the phone, first of all, the whole time he was sitting in a doctor's office, worried, because he was waiting for tests to come through. It turned out to be prostate. That was not his eventual problem, but he didn't know that. So through the whole conversation, he's a little on edge to begin with. And that was a kind of an anniversary for him at that point, because 25 years before that, he was the first country musician ever to be on the cover of Downbeat, the jazz magazine, because they understood even then, and I mean, what Downbeat cares about country music, you couldn't even find a stick to shake at, I mean, it's like, but they realized Merle was different, and they interviewed him about what was this, and what were his interests, and why was he doing these things. And one of the questions I asked him, to give you an idea of Merle, where his excitement lies, I said, So you came to Capitol Records in 1965, and I said, that was right at the time Nat King Cole was finishing up. Now we're doing Unforgettable, which is a Nat King Cole song. He said, did you meet him at Capitol? It seemed like you might. He said, now, people who remember, late Nat King Cole was doing things like Ramblin' Rose, so there was a kind of a country tinge to it. I just figured there would have been a conversation. He said, no, I didn't run into him. He was not well. It was the end of his life. He said, we never got to talk. He said, but I would have been so overwhelmed if we had. And he talked about, well, I traveled to visit Johnny Mercer's house. You have to remember, Johnny Mercer was running Capitol Records. He owned it in those days. So, and, naturally, the Southern pop guys, I went to his house. We loved all that. And he talked about how much he loved what Natalie Cole was doing at the time, with a Merle. This is not the Merle that people were used to thinking. But if you got him on a musical jag, the words just came flowing out of him. He's one of these people you meet, very few in my lifetime. And I've interviewed, I don't know, probably close to 600 people over the last 50 years, and musicians, alone, and out of Merle's one of these people where the words just flew out of him. He spoke poetry. Anybody who knew him will tell you things would come out of his mouth. He's like, I see where these lyrics come from. He just talks that way. You don't have to think about it. These phrases come out. It's like, somebody should be writing this down. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. But that's how he talked, And when he talked, the other thing is, when he talked about getting it right, the thing that mattered most was the feel of it, and especially the rhythm of it. So he would praise Nat King Cole. He said, well, the thing, Barry, is, he was a really good piano player. So he knew, the beat right when he sang. And he talked about Bing Crosby even. He said, well, did you see him dance with Fred Astaire? See, he was also a dancer. So that's what mattered. He said, I didn't like Bing so much as a crooner, actually. So when he was a jazz singer at the beginning, and it was really interesting what he did. So Merle, as being interested, first of all, in the rhythm, is probably not the way people think about him. We're arguing over was his politics right wing, left wing, change wing, UFO wing? What was Merle Haggard? It wasn't particularly what interested him most. He was a music geek. What he had to say ultimately when he talked to me at length from my Jimmy Rogers book, inevitably, and you can see it in there. But ultimately, what he said about Rogers was, sum up. What do you think? What was so good about him? And he said the tempos and the attitudes never sagged. That's what he said to me. And those are the things, that's kind of Merle. Give me the tempo, give me the attitude. And, I figure he just told me who he was. It's like when he told documentary makers at the end of his life that the reason he loved working on the bus was because that place he slept in the back room was the same size and shape as his cell, only it moved. And that was telling you as much about Merle Haggard as he ever told anybody. That was, I think, the most revealing thing he ever said. My buddy David Cantwell, who's got the best book about understanding Merle, you should all read that. But it made to the same point. It was like a moving cell was the best freedom he could imagine. Yeah. So that's part of who Merle was, too. While we were talking about Jimmy Rogers, in passing, I mentioned something to him that I'd just seen at the Hall of Fame, which was a clip. I was working on some stuff about country music on television and the way it was handled. A book I've never written, but have almost written about 3 times. It doesn't exist, that book, which is Country Music on the Screen, which was a natural thing for me to look at, screen backgrounds and love the music. So may happen yet, but I'll be very old. But I said, Merle, I just saw the other day at the Hall of Fame, I just saw this clip from Ozark Jubilee from the 50s. Of Bob Wills and his fiddler Cecil Brower very arguably a better fiddler than he was, in a fiddle cutting contest right on the film. And he just freaked out. He called his wife, "Get in here." He's telling me, Barry Mazor here, he's telling me he saw this Bob Wills fiddle. He said, "Where'd you know? Is that the Hall of Fame has that?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Who do I call so I can see that the next time I'm there?" I mean, so this is, sheer music geek joy, which apparently he did. He told me about, in that same conversation, he said, "Barry, listen, I had this dream once. So I had a dream that I died and gone to heaven. And my father was there, because my father was my hero. And he said, 'Merle, we got to hurry.' I said, 'Why?' He said, 'Because Jimmy Rogers and Lefty Frizzell were doing a show and you've got to open.' And then he laughed out loud so hard. We were... I thought that was kind of telling also of the stories. I finally got to see him at the Hall of Fame sometime later. I did a lot of work with Connie Smith. I did 2 Bear family books with her. She sat right here in this same room, and on that porch, and we did also at Marty's offices, but between them, we must have done 40 hours of interviews for those 2 books. I'm not kidding. That's a lot of work, those books. You gotta have it right, like Merle would say. And Merle was inducting her into the Hall of Fame when she finally got in, and I was invited to be there. And I wanted to see him because it turned out when the Jimmy Rogers book came, I sent him an autographed copy, and it turned out that his staff had swiped it, and I heard that it never reached his hands. So I brought another copy and was going to be there, and we're just outside the hall on the way in to the induction, and he was inducting Connie, and Marty Stewart brought me over to him, and I said, "Merle, I'm Barry Mazor." And he looked me over head to tail and he went, "Yes, you are." And inside I gave him the book and we talked about we talked about that. Also, it didn't end there for us. He did a whole record of Ralph Peer published songs. It's called the Pure tapes or something. There was a whole record. And he got close to them, which was part and parcel of having done all that research about Jimmy Rogers and Bob Wills, both of whom were originally published by Ralph Peer. So he got close to them because he was a music geek. And he did that album, which was a lot of songs he wanted. And so some of you will have seen the last thing he did for me. He was really close to the end, but he had this picture taken, holding my Ralph Peer book up, which is something I'll treasure. I'll treasure all these things. It's knowing this guy on that kind of first name basis, and the things he revealed to me are going to be something I'll treasure all my life.
How did you hear about his passing?
Same way as I think I heard, how did I hear about his passing? I think the same way as everybody else, because they put the word out on it pretty fast from when he did. So I didn't have other people who knew him get to call me first, which does happen sometimes. And, ask you not to mention this for the next day or two. Had that with all too many people lately. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, I think I heard like other people did, but he knew he was sick. I mean, it was not a shock that he was like kind of near the end. I saw him one more time because I was there at the Marty Stewart show when he taped the show with him near the end. It was wonderful. He was doing some of the hymns that he'd recorded, which was not usual for Merle to do those, but he made a point. He's always made a point. The reason I'm interested in all these different kinds of music and the reason I don't sound just like they do, and the things I've recorded are not the same as they do in Nashville necessarily, is because I came up through saloons in Bakersfield, not church choirs in, Appalachia. But when I say that, he would say, understand that my mother was still a Baptist. I knew all those songs anyway. So we finally did this hymns album, and he put that out. And on the Stewart show, he did a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and he did one of those. And he came out, and we were sitting right there. I was sitting with Eddie, but he disappeared so much at the end, I didn't get to say hi, which would have been my last chance. But we saw him up close, and that was a wonderful thing to see. It was a great show.
I heard stories he used to go to the Hall of Fame and they would let him play Jimmy Rogers' guitar. Do you know anything about that?
Oh, well, that's no doubt true. The Jimmy Rogers guitar that's at the Hall of Fame. Now, there's about 6 legitimate Jimmy Rogers guitars. That's the first thing to know. And the one at the Hall of Fame is the Martin that were used on the Bristol sessions. That was the one he got before he broke. The one that's considered the $1 million guitar, which people often think of as Ernest Tubbs' guitar, because it's the one you flip and it says thanks on the back. Well, that was loaned to Ernest Tubbs by Mrs. Jimmy Rogers. That was the main Jimmy Rogers guitar he used in shows and most of his records. And that is still owned by the Rogers family to this day, 4th generation. But it's on display most of the time, except when it's very rarely traveled, at the Jimmy Rogers Museum in Meridian, Mississippi. They let it out to the Grammy once last year, and that's been valued at $1 million. So I don't know if it'll ever wind up in the Hall of Fame, but so they need benefactors to pay the people who own them. They've got the Earl Scruggs banjo, they got the Bill Monroe mandolin, etc., because families were taken care of, and the families have a right to be. But
do we know anything about Merle playing the?
I think that's probably true. I don't know specifically, dates and days, but he definitely would have asked, and they definitely would have said yes. There's also a sort of Rogers guitar in the hall. He signed a contract with Wayman Guitars, which were kind of cheap guitars from Pennsylvania, and they got his name on it. They sold those to people when he was still alive as Jimmy Rogers guitars, and they got one of those in the case in the hall too. I don't know whether Merle wanted to bother with that because he would have known this story. It was not one of the ones Jimmy cared about, but he sold them. I think, to me, Merle's legacy, first of all, it extends beyond country music for the very reasons we're talking about. His interests, his tastes, and his influences were wider than that. You can't put it in that box. He didn't. And so you can say at once that he was like one of the major songwriters and I think music makers of the century, of American music in general. But you can also say, I'll say that to me, he is the greatest single figure if you have to pick one. The good news is you don't have to pick one. But if somebody broke your arm and they keep trying, I would say Merle. It's, you can say, well, doesn't Hank Williams write songs as good? Yeah, arguably. And doesn't George Jones sing as well? Yeah, arguably. And it says, and Willie's a heck of a band leader. Yeah, heck, Emmylou Harris was a heck of a band leader. For the band you put together. But if you want to have somebody who did all of those and also contributed so much to understanding where it all came from, I think that's the guy.
So what are we about to listen to, Barry?
When I was interviewing Merle for my Meeting Jimmy Rogers book, which was a necessity. I mean, I learned a lot about Rogers from him. He told me, just spontaneously, he decided to tell me about this dream he had, and I thought it was so revealing of who he was that I've kept it aside ever since. And this is that's what this is.
I had a dream one time that I died, and I got to the other side, and my dad met me. My dad was my hero. My dad met me, and he it's kind of like we got into a station, like a train station, and he helped me out of the train, and he said we got to hurry up. And I said, why are we in a hurry? He said, well, you're on the show with Jimmy Rogers and Lefty Frizzell, and you're opening the show.
The traffic noise, he was in a doctor's waiting room, and it was like by the window, there's all this traffic going by. But that's it. Yeah.
That's beautiful.